Inns pressed her fingers into the dry earth and squeezed. Nothing came out. No moisture, no color. Only yellow dust that the Veracruz wind carried away before she could see where it went. Welcome to Stories Between Lives. That morning, the neighbors of San Marcos del Monte watched her from the other side of the gate without saying a word. They didn't need to. The way they looked away said everything. Ins Soledad Garza was 22 years old and the owner of half a hectare of what everyone in town called the dead woman's land. Her grandmother Consuelo had worked it for 40 years with calloused hands and a will like stone, but since Doa Consuelo had closed her eyes for the last time, the earth had gone rigid and gray, as though it too were in mourning for the old woman who had loved it. The adobe hut still stood, but barely. 2 cracked walls, a rusted tin roof that sang with the wind, and a door that no longer closed all the way because the frame had warped over years of dampness and abandonment. Inns had known all this before she arrived. She had seen it on her last visit 3 years before, the time she had come to say goodbye to her grandmother without knowing that was what it was. Now it was hers. All the poverty, all the silence, all the dust. Hers. She had grown up alone since she was 9 years old. Her parents died in the same December. First, her father. From a fever, the municipal doctors called one thing and the neighbors called another. And then her mother, who faded away from grief without making much noise. Doa Consuelo, her mother's mother, took her in without thinking twice. She raised her on what the hillside gave and on the dignity that poverty had never managed to strip from her, which was considerable. When Inns was old enough, she left for Tzalapa to find work. She found a kitchen, a borrowed room, a small life, but her own. And then came the notary's letter telling her the land was hers, and that if she didn't claim it within 90 days, the municipality would absorb it for common use. Inns gathered what she had in the borrowed room, told the boarding house woman she wasn't coming back, and boarded the 5 o'clock morning bus. God willing, she thought as the bus wound through the mountain curves, something can be done. The first to speak was Remedios Calvo, the one with the vegetable stand at the market, who had spent 30 years being the walking newspaper of San Marcos del Monte. Remedios was a woman with a round voice and square opinions, and what she thought of the situation she said in front of 3 people, who repeated it to 8 more that same afternoon. That Doa Consuelo's land hadn't produced anything in years. That half a hectare of dust was a laughingstock of an inheritance. That the orphan would arrive, see there was nothing to be done, and leave before the month was out. Remedios said it with the kind of pity that is more comfortable than respect. And when Inns passed her stall on the second day, hauling her bag toward the property, Remedios greeted her with that same pity, wrapped in a smile and a remark about the heat. Don Aurelio Ulloa, who owned the largest ranch in the municipality and 3 trucks no one else in San Marcos could afford, rode past the gate of Inns's property one early morning. He didn't stop. He looked the land over with narrowed eyes from atop his mule, the way men do who are accustomed to calculating the worth of things at a glance, and continued on his way. 3 days later, he sent his farmhand Abundio with a verbal offer. The boss would give her half what the property was worth, a generous price for land that was no good, and she should take it before the offer went cold. Abundio delivered it the way a man delivers a message he already knows how it will end. "Tell the boss no," said Inns. "Begging your pardon," replied Abundio, with the face of a man doing his part. "But the boss says don't take too long changing your mind." "Thank you," said Inns, and went back to her furrows. What no one knew that day, because no one had asked and she had not said, was that Inns had cried that night. Not from fear or sadness exactly, but from that exhaustion that comes from standing alone for too long without anyone to hold you up. She sat on the cot with her hands still dirty and cried with her mouth closed, slowly, the way she had learned to do since childhood, without making noise so as not to trouble anyone. Then she washed her face with water from the clay jug, wrapped herself in the earth-colored shawl, and lay down. The next morning she rose before the dew had lifted and went back to the field. It was inside the hut, under the cot, that she found the little wooden box. It was small, the size of a shoebox, made of cedar with iron hinges already rusted, and it smelled of old dust and something Inns couldn't name, but recognized as the smell of her grandmother. Inside, wrapped in a folded piece of cloth, was the seed notebook. Doa Consuelo's round handwriting filled every page with names written in charcoal pencil, packed so tightly that Inns had to hold the notebook up to the morning light to read them. Water bio bean, shadow black bean, seasonal fat bean. Each variety with its month, its planting distance, its depth in the furrow, and 3 or 4 more words that were not instructions but memory. My mother found this variety in the mountains. I brought this one from Misantla the year Lupe was born. This one survived the drought of '87 without a single drop of help. Inns closed the notebook carefully, held it with both hands, felt something in her chest she couldn't quite name, but which was close to not being alone. 3 days passed before Don Celso Miramontes appeared at the gate. He was a small, lean man, his skin dark as the bark of a cypress tree, with a hat so old it no longer remembered its original shape, and the hands of someone who had worked the earth since before he learned to write his own name. He carried a sack over his shoulder and didn't greet her right away. First he looked at the field, left to right, slowly, the way a person reads something the others can't see. Then he looked at Inns. "I came to see how bad it is," he said. "Pretty bad," Inns answered. "I can see that," said Don Celso, and set the sack on the ground. "Do you have your grandmother's notebook?" Inns went to the hut and brought it. Don Celso opened it with thick fingers, turning each page without hurrying, reading with the same seriousness with which he had studied the field. When he reached the last entry Doa Consuelo had made, he stopped, read it twice, then closed the notebook and set it on top of the little wooden box. "Do you know how to plant beans?" "A little," said Inns. "What she taught me when I was small." "Then you already have the hardest part," said the old man. "The rest you'll learn here." And that was all. Don Celso took the hoe Inns had found hanging on the hut wall, went to the field, and started working. Inns followed. The routine established itself on its own, without anyone naming it. Don Celso arrived while the morning dew was still in the air, before the Veracruz sun had fully cleared the ridge, and they worked together until midday. He brought a clay jug of pot-brewed coffee that Inns started waiting for each morning, without admitting it. She learned to read the earth with her fingers, the same way she had learned to read onions in the kitchen of the Xalapa boarding house, slowly, attentively, without skipping anything. Don Celso didn't explain much. He showed. He did the thing once, and then waited for Inns to do it too. When she made a mistake, he didn't correct her with words, but with the hoe. He repeated the right motion without saying the previous one had been wrong. That was how Inns learned to open furrows at the exact angle so water wouldn't run sideways. To recognize when the earth needed more than water, when what it needed was to be turned, to let the air in. To tell apart the weeds that did harm from those that simply grew, without taking anything from anyone. One morning, while they were preparing the furrows for the first planting, Don Celso said without lifting his eyes from the ground, "The land isn't bad. It's thirsty deep down, not up top." Inns didn't fully understand, but she kept it. She wore the earth-colored shawl every morning, knotted at the waist because her hands had to stay free. Over time, it took on the smell of the damp soil they slowly turned up. and the smell of the night fire when Inns cooked her pot beans on the wood-burning stove, and the smell of the Veracruz dew, different from Salapa's, heavier, denser with the hillside. And the seed notebook always stayed on top of the little wooden box, open, with the most used pages marked with scraps of cloth. The neighbors kept watching. Remedios Calvo walked the dirt road with her basket on her arm and cast an eye at the property and shook her head the way you shake your head at something you already know how it ends. The women of the market asked among themselves how much longer the girl would hold out. Petra Ulloa, Don Aurelio's wife, remarked what a shame it was that Doa Consuelo's land had fallen like that into the hands of someone with nothing at all, and that hopefully someone would explain to the girl it was better to sell before she ruined it entirely. No one said any of that to Inns directly. They said good morning when they passed her on the road, asked how it was going, and when she said fine, they nodded with that small-town politeness that commits to nothing. One evening, while they gathered the tools at dusk, Inns asked Don Celso why he was helping her. The old man was slow to answer. He took a sip of what remained in the jug and looked out at the freshly turned furrows. "Because your grandmother helped me when I needed it most," he said at last. "And nobody ever asked me if I wanted to pay that back or not. I was left carrying it. So here I am." Inns nodded. She didn't ask anything more. By the end of May, the first shoots of the water bio bean had come up. Not many at first, but there they were. Small, a green different from the ordinary bean shoots the others planted in the region. Darker, sturdier from the very first day. Don Celso checked them each morning with his fingers, touching the base of each stem, smelling the earth around them. "They're searching," he would say. "For what?" Inns asked once. "For what's below," he answered, and said nothing more. Inns learned to recognize the leaves, to read the color as it shifted while the plant found what it needed. She learned when to water and when not to, because the water bio bean, according to Doa Consuelo's notes and the quiet experience of Don Celso, preferred controlled thirst to abundance without measure. Its roots went deeper than any other variety in the region. That was what set it apart. That was what had saved it in the drought of '87, when the Garza Milpa was the only one to bring in a full harvest across 3 municipalities in northern Veracruz. Every morning was the same, and that sameness began to feel like a coat. Don Celso arrived before dawn. Inns already had the fire going and the griddle hot. He left the clay jug of pot coffee on the porch table without a word and went straight to the furrows. Inns followed with the hoe. They worked in silence until the sun grew hot enough that they had to stop for water. They ate what there was, fresh tortillas, pot beans, sometimes an egg. Then back to the furrows until mid-afternoon, and when the sun dropped and the heat eased, Don Celso sat in the porch chair and Inns sat on the step, and neither said anything in particular. But there was no empty silence either. It was the silence of 2 people who have come to an agreement without needing words. A woman from the market, Luciana Flores, came by one midday with a basket and knocked on the gatepost with her knuckles. She'd brought a fistful of fresh eggs wrapped in a cloth napkin. She left them with Inns and went away without staying to chat. The next day another woman came, the bricklayer's wife from 2 streets up, with a little goat cheese wrapped in a banana leaf. Neither of them said they were there to make up for anything. Neither said they had been wrong. They simply left what they brought and left. Inns received it with the right thanks and without asking anything. Don Celso watched all of it from the porch chair without a word. That night, Inns opened the seed notebook and wrote in the margin of the Bayo bean page, month of June, first shoot, 22 days after planting. Dry earth, no rain for 8 days, shoots healthy. Something below that I don't yet understand, Don Aurelio's letter arrived that same week, this time written on letterhead, the name of his ranch in gold lettering at the top. Abundio delivered it at the gate with the face of someone who would rather be elsewhere. The letter said, in the language of someone who employs lawyers, that Ser Ulloa had consulted with the municipal engineer about the underground water rights in the area, and that if Ser Rita Garza had any interest in a conversation on the matter, he was available to receive her at his ranch any afternoon of the week. Inns folded the letter, put it inside the little wooden box, under the seed notebook. She did not go to the ranch. In that slow learning filled with small mistakes, Inns was putting down roots of her own. She didn't notice it right away. She noticed it when she began to know the names of the birds that came to the property at dawn, a kind of thrush that sang from the mesquite in the corner, which she started waiting for each morning, without realizing she was waiting. She noticed it when she learned which corner of the hut the north wind didn't reach, and moved her cot there. She noticed it when she stopped counting the days until something, and simply began living the one she was in. Something inside her that had been loose for years found a place to stand. But Don Celso still didn't know that this land was holding something neither of them had imagined. That July, the drought came. Not all at once. Those are the easy ones. Because you can prepare. This was the drought that arrives on cat's feet. First taking away the afternoon rains, then the early morning rains, and finally leaving the Veracruz sky quiet and white for weeks on end. Don Aurelio's fields began to yellow at the edges. The corn farmer down the slope lost his maize first, and then lost his voice from so much silent cursing. The town well dropped, and the municipality had to ration water to alternate days. Inz's beans stayed green. Remedios Calvo stopped at the gate for the first time on a Monday in August, basket on her arm, eyes fixed on the furrows. She said nothing. She looked. The next day Petra Ulloa passed on her way to the market, and also stopped. Also looked. By Thursday, 5 different women had passed with 5 different excuses for being there. They were all looking at the same thing, the green furrows in the land everyone had written off. Don Celso knew, though he didn't say so. One morning, while Inz was loosening the earth between the furrows with the hoe, she heard the old man stop. He knelt down, scraped at a spot with his fingers, a spot Inz hadn't noticed, 1.5 meters from the first furrow, where the earth was a different color. Darker, almost black compared to the gray of the rest. "There's water here," said Don Celso, without raising his voice. Inz knelt beside him. The soil the old man had pulled up was cold. Damp, not from rain, from something coming from deeper down. An underground vein? Subterranean. The bean roots found it and followed it. That's why they're so green. He wiped his fingers on his trousers. That's why your grandmother planted this variety here. She knew, a long time ago. Inz felt a chill run up her spine, even as the Veracruz sun pressed down with everything it had. Don Celso went to the hut. He took out the little wooden box and set it on the porch table, opened the seed notebook and leafed to the last page. And then he saw what neither of them had seen before, pressed with wax to the bottom of the box, folded in 4, was a piece of paper. "I didn't know this was here," said Inz. "Neither did I," answered the old man. "But your grandmother did." It was a letter from Doa Consuelo, dated the 12th of March, 4 years before, written in the same round hand as the notebook, but more compressed, with 2 signatures at the bottom besides her own, that of Don Bernal, the retired schoolteacher at the end of the road, and that of a public official from the municipality of Misantla. The letter described the property with exact measurements, named In Soledad Garza as sole heir, and made explicit mention of an underground water current that Doa Consuelo had identified 40 years earlier at the same exact point where Don Celso had just knelt. At the bottom of the letter was a reference to a file number from the municipal water registry. Don Bernal confirmed the number that same afternoon. The document was valid. It was registered. And in times of drought, a subterranean current on private land was worth more than the land itself. Don Aurelio Ulloa arrived 4 days later, this time without sending a bundio ahead. He came himself, on horseback, with a man carrying a black briefcase whom he introduced as an engineer from Salapa. The two of them came in from the road. The engineer opened the briefcase and drew out a map of the municipal hydraulic zone. Don Aurelio spoke with the voice of a man accustomed to things going his way. He explained to Inns that the underground current could feed wells on 3 properties if drilled in the right place, that they had the means to do the drilling, that the most sensible thing would be a shared use agreement with a monthly payment, that it was the fairest outcome for everyone, especially in difficult times. He set the contract on the little wooden box. "Sign here," he said, "and everything is settled by this week." Inns read it slowly. Twice, then folded it and handed it back. "No," she said. Don Aurelio blinked. "Miss, your neighbors are in need. There are families with nothing to water with." "Yes," Inns answered. "And I have a harvest to protect. When it's ready, we'll talk about everyone else's water, but on my terms and with my signature where I decide to put it." Don Aurelio looked at her, looked at Don Celso, who stood beside the bean furrows without moving, hat in hand. And it was Don Celso who spoke, slowly and without raising his voice, with the calm of someone who doesn't need to raise it to be heard. This girl worked land nobody wanted to work. She found water nobody knew how to look for because nobody bothered to look. She didn't come to ask for anything or complain about anything. She came to plant. Whoever wants to deal with her had better do it with respect, or leave the way they came. Silence. Inns stood with her back straight and her feet planted in her own earth. She looked at Don Aurelio without blinking. "This land produces nothing," they said. She said quietly, "Look at it now. A woman alone can't manage a ranch," they had said. "Better she sign and go," they had said. And yet here she was, with the greenest furrows in the municipality in the worst drought year the elders could remember. Don Aurelio gathered his contract, bid her good afternoon. The engineer closed his briefcase, and they left down the dirt road without another word. That evening, as the sun went orange over the hillside, 2 women from the market appeared at the gate. Inns greeted them from the porch. This time there was no pity in the greeting that came back. One asked if she could teach them something about the beans. The other asked whether the variety in Doa Consuelo's notebook could be planted in her own field. Inns said yes, with pleasure. By the time autumn arrived, the plot of Inns Soledad Garza was the only one in San Marcos del Monte to have brought in a full harvest that year. The furrows were heavy with fat pods of bio bean, and Don Celso sat in the porch chair, drinking his pot coffee with his eyes on the field, reading something in it that seemed to settle him. Doa Consuelo's seed notebook rested open on the little wooden box with new notes in Inns's handwriting beside her grandmother's, and the fattest pods of the harvest laid out to dry around it, like an offering nobody had planned, but that came out exactly right. The water agreement arrived in November, on Inns's terms, with Don Bernal reviewing every clause and Don Celso present as witness. Don Aurelio accepted because it was the only reasonable thing left, and because the people of the town had already started to look at Inns differently, which is the only kind of power that truly changes things in a small place. 6 women learned to sew that winter using Doa Consuelo's notebook. Inns taught them what she had learned. Hands in the earth. Patient. Skipping nothing. The earth-colored shawl hung on the hut door in the afternoon air, already carrying the smell of that place woven into every thread. One afternoon, while they were gathering the last pods before the cold came, Don Celso looked at the full field and said without taking his eyes from the furrows, "Your grandmother would be pleased." Inns pressed the pod she held in her hand. "God willing," she answered, very quietly. "I think she already knows. Sometimes inside someone who seems defeated there is a root still searching for water. There is a seed kept in a little box that no one has opened yet. There is a notebook written by someone who didn't get to say everything they knew, but who left it written so that whoever came next would find it in time. And the land that everyone wrote off, it turns out it always knew how to hold what was entrusted to it. Do you believe the worst moments can be the beginning of something better? If this story touched something in your heart, leave us your comment down below and tell us what part of the country you're watching from. Subscribe to the Stories Between Lives channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single story. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the land that seems dead is sometimes only waiting for the person who knows how to listen to it. Until the next story. A heartfelt embrace. From heart to heart. That night, when Inns put out the fire and listened to the north wind moving through the already harvested furrows, she stood for a moment in the doorway of the hut looking out. And in a very low voice, as though speaking to someone nearby, she said, "I am from where I was loved, grandmother, and here I stay."